Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Coming up, China stresses economic development as central task during the country's 15th five-year plan period. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is in India to repair a strained relationship. In the second half, we will focus on the US and Israel's war against Iran. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on our previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. First up, a top meeting in China has described the next 5 years as a critical period for socialist modernization. General Secretary Xi Jinping chaired a meeting of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China Central Committee. It reviewed a draft outline of the country's 15th five-year plan and discussed a draft government work report that will be submitted to the annual session of the National Legislature for review. The meeting said that economic development should remain the government's central task over the next 5 years. It called for more proactive and effective policies to expand domestic demand and optimize supply. It has also emphasized the need to develop new quality productive forces in light of local conditions and to ensure stability in businesses, employment, and markets. For more, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Dr. Yin Liang, professor of economics with Willamette University.
So, Yan, China's 15th five-year plan is a critical period for building modernization. So what areas do you think China will focus on in the coming years?
Well, in terms of areas, I think really what stand out are three things. One is that the Chinese government will continue to promote technological innovations and technological-led sort of innovation-driven growth. And so this includes, promoting technological breakthroughs, but also diffusion of technologies into traditional industries to upgrade the traditional industries. I think that is one major focus of the new five-year plan, but also in 2026. And second has to do with boosting domestic demand. That includes, optimization of investment demands, but also just expand consumption demand. And I think consumption demand growth is also giving a lot of priority because I think this is in China's strategic interest and see it as a priority to have a supply-demand side balanced kind of growth. And investment growth is also very important because we know that investment is ultimate the source of income growth and job creation. So to be able to optimize investment, I think it's also a very important priority for the government in the five-year plan. And last but not least, I think the importance that has been emerging right now is the idea of using finance to build China as a financially empowered and strong economy, because it is very important to boost, the sort of financial architecture to enable China to not only become, sort of a financially strong economy, but also to remove some of the chokeholds, I would say, in the global economy. And all of these, I think, coupled with the idea of investment in the people to strengthen social safety net, to provide, opportunities to help to promote living standards for the great majority of the people. I think all of these are important. And last but not the least, of course, is about green transition, sustainable development. So I think all of these are important pillars of this new five-year plan.
And the new quality productive forces is now central to China's modernization strategy. So could you elaborate more on that, the future industries, new industrialization, and innovation capacity building?
Right. So the new quality productive forces are really the key, as you mentioned, to China's modernization, but also the idea of high quality productivity, high quality development. So you're right. I think China in the past 4 decades have been really have this breakneck growth rate. But now I think the government has decided to lead the economy to pivot from high-speed growth, the scale-driven growth, to more productivity growth, driven growth, and more sort of inclusive and also sustainable growth. Because when you rely too much on resource-intensive growth, that means your growth may slow down once you reach a certain height level, but also it could create a lot more environmental, degradation. And also it becomes less sustainable when you are continue to pile on resources to drive that growth. So that is why it's very important to pivot towards the more innovation-driven, productively-led growth. And so that means to nurture, this new productive forces. And on the one hand, is to promote new emerging industries and also future industries. So these are the industries that embody, cutting edge technologies, their promise to have new emerging, markets and also potentials. And on the other hand, the idea is to diffuse these leading edge technologies into the traditional industries. Because after all, the Chinese economy is still having a lot of these traditional industries like construction, mining, light manufacturing, light industries, and service industries. So a lot of these industries can grow in a more high quality and more sustainable way if there is more, technological driven growth. So the point here is not only to have technological breakthroughs and have these sort of new fields for technological growth, but more importantly is to diffuse the technology. So be it AI or humanoids, robotics, these technologies are general purpose technologies. So they can be embodied in manufacturing sector, in the service sector, and in agriculture sector. And so that is the way to really promote the more sort of a broader economic growth driven by the technologies.
And you mentioned the domestic demand. We've seen that the total retail sales exceeded 50 trillion yuan last year, and that is up 3.7% from a year ago. So how do you think will policies further unlock the consumption potential, especially in services and rural markets?
Right. So the service industry or service consumption is really important. As we know, as China's income continues to grow, families and individuals, they're now tending to increase the service consumption. So that means healthcare, education, tourism, entertainment, recreation, and so on and so forth, and also business services, and that are also really important to continue to drive China's growth. So I think when it comes to the service industries, the government has been both promoting the demand side for services, for example, by providing better healthcare plans, but providing more social safety net. It allows consumers to be able to spend more in a discretionary spending in the service industry. And on the other hand, the government is also nurturing from the supply side, the service industry, right? That means to provide more guidance and to allow more, for example, foreign investments into the service industry. So the idea here is that by nurturing new service industries, but providing more consumption scenarios, it allows people and consumers to have more service, the more quality service. So that's both from the supply side and demand side to promote the service industry. And I think you also mentioned the rural markets, and that of course is also very important. As we know that the Chinese urbanization rate is over 65, it's around 65%, but that means there's still quite a bit of the rural residents whose consumption level is still relatively low, despite having a relatively faster growth than urban consumption. So again, to unlock, I think, this kind of rural market from a low base, I think there is a huge potential. So again, the idea of providing more social safety net to nurture more quality service supply, and I think all of this will be helpful. Now, of course, in addition to the service and rural consumption, the government is also promoting policies in general. For example, the trade-in program and various consumption subsidies program that would help to directly stimulate consumption. And last but not the least, having the social safety net, so then allow what people would call they dare to consume, right? So they don't need to worry about ramping up the precautionary savings. So all of these, I think, are important. And what that means is that you need to have a holistic policy package to promote consumption, to promote income and jobs, to promote social safety net, to promote quality suppliers. And I think that would be a comprehensive policy to really help to rebalance the economy towards more consumption, consumption growth.
Yan Liang, professor of economics with Willamette University, talking with my colleague Zhao Yang. You're listening to World Today. Stay tuned. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has met with his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi in New Delhi. Carney is currently on a 4-day visit to India. The trip has been described by officials as historic. Bilateral ties deteriorated sharply after former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau linked Indian agents to the killing of a Sikh separatist leader on Canadian soil. India formally rejected that very allegation. Since taking office last year, Carney has moved to re-engage with India. So for more, joining us now on the line is Zoom Ahmed Khan, research fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. So thank you very much for joining us today, Zoom. Relations between the two sides improved last year when Prime Minister Carney invited Prime Minister Modi to a G7 summit held in Alberta, Canada. Why do you think Carney is putting aside the frictions over the killing of the Sikh activist a couple of years ago and are now re-engaging with the Indian side?
Thank you, firstly, for inviting me. One of the lenses through which we need to understand this shift is the domestic politics, first of all. I mean, it was quite known that Justin Trudeau, his party, his own, political support also came from the local Sikh communities, which are very politically active. And we know that there's a whole Khalistan movement counter to what the Indian government wants for the Sikh community in India. So there's a domestic lens, and Carney being a very quintessential pragmatist. He, first of all, does not, for his domestic political support, rely on those communities as much as Trudeau did. And at the same time, I think what Carney has very vocally said, especially I think at the World Economic Forum, his speech became very, popular, was this idea of middle power realism, and to shift away from politics of ideology versus pragmatism. And he himself is an economist. He has been, leading the banking systems of two different countries. Given the frictions that they currently have with the Trump administration, with the United States, where 75% of Canada's exports go. This is also a time for Carney to think about how can they rely more on other economies versus relying so heavily on the United States, where the policies can shift to their detriment. That's a very important aspect to look into. One of the things that has been noticed and also criticized by the local Sikh politicians is that Carney has decided not to visit Punjab, which his predecessor always did. And he is trying to distance himself from those frictions. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, but now officially, from what I understand, the Canadian government's position with Carney has shifted from accusing India of being a country that sponsored terrorism, conducted state-sponsored terrorism in Canada, versus a country where they want to address those issues in a more subtle way between the two sides. And at the same time, Carney wants to open options for Canada to diversify in terms of trade, economic future.
So, by the way, Zoom, do you think the unresolved security disputes between the two sides will naturally disappear as they decide to focus more on the cooperative part of their relationship?
No, we can talk about, again, realism in a world that's becoming increasingly unpredictable, and a country like Canada being so disproportionately dependent on what's become the most volatile economy in the world, will need to set aside some of the outlying issues for the time being in order to move forward with growing opportunities. But that said, I don't think we have, between any two countries, a precedent of such issues simply disappearing. Look at our own region. The best that we can hope for, if Canada and India really want to move forward with economic ties, which do have a lot of potential for the time being, is to compartmentalize these issues. But they will need to, I mean, understand how the Sikh communities and the Indian government have contrary aspirations. And the Canadian Sikh community remains, even if it's not Carney's direct political support, it remains significant within Canada. They are a very influential community as well. And the issues they have with the current Modi administration, they cannot disappear overnight. And if such incidents happen again, if there is another incident of what was nothing less than no short of state-sponsored terrorism at that time towards Canadian nationals, then maybe that compartmentalization will become problematic. So I don't believe they can disappear overnight. I do think that if the Indian government also wants to benefit from deeper ties with Canada, also wants to diversify for its own sake as well, then they might need to reach a more clear consensus on what happened, how it can be resolved, and how those issues cannot happen again, how to avoid such incidents from happening again. But disappearing, no, such issues do not disappear. At best, between two mature economies who have decided to move the pragmatic way forward for national interests, for economic interests, they can at best compartmentalize it for now. But dialogue between the two sides, whether it's closed door, very strategic, it has to continue if they really want to resolve the outlying issues.
Carney has set a goal for Canada to double its non-U.S. exports in the next decade. To what extent can trade with India help Canada achieve that goal?
One of the advantages, if they both, the Canadian and the Indian economy, want to move forward, is that they do have complementary economies. So Canada has what India really needs, which is food security, minerals, energy. And India also has what Canada needs, which is consumer class that is growing, also a lot of technical talent. So I think in this sense, they can find areas of cooperation that have the capacity, the potential to be scaled. Secondly, I mean, I think sectoral growth beyond raw materials, the Canadian pension funds are among the largest investors, in Indian infrastructure. So doubling trade isn't just about shipping goods. It's also about integrating Canadian capital into India's digital and physical build out. And this is something that India is also actively seeking. So I think they have potential. They have complementary economies, complementary realities. They both have the interest to diversify and to move away from being more ideological towards being more pragmatic. But at the same time, it will take time. And the extent to which the Indian economy, which, as we all know, I mean, India has the issue of not being very centralized in achieving an economic goal, the way the Chinese economy has been. So there might be issues when it comes to the extent to which Canada can expect India to absorb Canadian investment and give the kind of results they can expect from a more, I would say, disciplined or a more advanced economy. But at the same time, I think it can play a role in Canada's overall vision to diversify. And that's where, India does have potential if both sides arrive at appropriate consensuses.
Now, we noticed that Canada and India have actually relaunched a ministerial level energy dialogue and are nowadays advancing their discussions surrounding uranium supply, conventional energy trade, and a clean energy cooperation. So with that in mind, why do you think energy is emerging as the central pillar of cooperation between India and Canada?
One of the ways to understand this that energy is indeed, with green transitions, with the need for rare earth minerals, with India's also ambitions to further its transition towards cleaner energy, and with Canada being mineral rich, it is definitely, it's emerging as one of the safest and maybe most mutually beneficial ground for cooperation. In terms of uranium and green transition, India is rapidly seeking to expand its nuclear fleet, to meet its net zero targets, and it is lagging behind for the time being. So Canada is, in some ways, a top tier uranium producer, and it can provide India with a relatively stable alternative to other suppliers, and that's all potentially speaking, right? And then when it comes to LNG and food security as well. We know that the global supply chains are heavily fractured also because of the Ukraine conflict, Russia-Ukraine conflict. So India does view Canada as maybe a partner for LNG and other potash fertilizer sources. And for Carney, this is potentially a win-win cooperation for exports because it creates high-paying jobs also back home, and especially in Western Canada, where they want to again, balance the economic prospects within the country. So to balance the country's domestic political interests, I think for Carney also potential exports towards India or other countries for these minerals can create more jobs and more economic activity in western parts of the country, which is also one of his goals.
So, like you mentioned earlier, Zoom Prime Minister Carney actually articulated his broader foreign policy visions when he was attending this year's Davos Forum in Switzerland back in January. This idea that middle powers should cooperate more closely in response to rifts, in response to fractures that we're seeing in terms of the existing global order. And of course, I guess his move to improve ties with India aligns very much with this particular vision here. So in a bigger picture sense, Zoom, do you think the current world order is creating more space for pragmatic cooperation between certain economies or countries?
Absolutely. For a country like Canada, I think what's known about Canada's foreign policy, that it is just an extension of American foreign policy. I think this is almost, sometimes it's a running joke, right? Like, what is Canada's own strategic interests? What are Canada's own pragmatic interests? And think about it, a country where 75% of their exports are going towards the United States, where the economies are so deeply interlinked, the supply chains are so deeply interlinked that it's almost as if it's the same country. For such a country, this new reality where the world order is shifting, it is shifting from being, I would say, also problematic, where one country has believed that it has the right, almost the duty, to break international law for its own interest, towards one where middle powers and increasingly other countries, with the rise of Asia and the global south, we are seeing the emergence of a world where pragmatism over ideology has to be the priority, has to be the litmus test for moving forward when it comes to relationships. And again, Carney's speech was very important because Canada is, again, the example of a country that is just pegged with a superpower without understanding that pragmatism or economic interests or strategic interests have to be based on national growth and national safety as well, right? So with his middle power strategic vision, with the middle power realism, I think, and of course, with the Trump administration's, constant imposing tariffs and being very volatile in a world that needs more stability and certainty, this middle power realism is going to be, I think, increasingly the way countries like Canada and even like India might decide to move forward. Instead of making choices based on ideology, instead of working against their own economic interests, the interests of their own people, they should move towards understanding where to cooperate and to expand ties and to deepen ties with emerging economies, with the global south, with emerging parts of the world, to ensure more opportunities back home, and also to diversify so that no one country can affect them the way they are being affected right now. So I think Carney's decision, his words at the Davos Forum, have really served as an eye-opener for other also countries and other leaders in the global south, in the global north, to understand that they need to work towards more strategically, more pragmatically, more practically, and to chase their own interests, economic interests, which are not based on pinning themselves ideologically with this global superpower hegemon, so to speak. So I think truly the world order is changing. It's changing towards more multilateralism, a more multipolar world order. And that shift is not just happening in the global south with BRICS, SCO. It is also happening now, especially with the realization of the global north, that they too need to diversify and links need to be established with the south and horizontally.
Thank you very much for joining us. Zoom Ahmed Khan, Research Fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. You're listening to World Today. We'll be back after a very short break. You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Iran's national security chief says the country will not negotiate with the United States. Ali Larijani made the remarks after U.S. President Donald Trump reportedly indicated that Tehran's new leadership wants to open dialogue. Iran has vowed to use the country's all strength to make its enemies pay a heavy price following the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in U.S.-Israeli strikes. President Donald Trump says military action against Iran could take up to 4 weeks. As tensions remain high, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian says the new leadership council has begun its work. In a phone call with his Russian counterpart, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said the attack on Iran during the negotiation process and the killing of a sovereign country's leader are unacceptable. For more on the situation in Iran, my colleague Xu Yawen first of all spoke with Sharuk Sae, a reporter with Tehran Times.
Sharak, as a journalist based in Tehran, you have experienced the recent airstrikes by the U.S. and Israel firsthand. Could you tell us the current situation on the ground in Tehran? What's the street scene like, and how are people reacting?
Since Israel and the United States launched deadly strikes on Iran, many residential areas have been targeted. Officials have confirmed that more than 200 people have been killed and hundreds of others have been injured. A single strike on a girls' school in the city of Minab in southern Iran led to the death of nearly 150 students. So this attack shows that Israel and US claims that they target military sites is completely wrong. Also, many areas in Tehran and other cities across the country have been targeted, in particular residential areas. But the country is being run properly. I use the metro every day. The metro is operating as usual and other means of transport. Although you might see panic in the street because it's natural. The United States and Israel are targeting residential areas. But you cannot see a chaos in the country because the country is still in order. And, the Iranian president and other relevant bodies are providing the services that should be provided as usual.
Iranian media confirmed the country's supreme leader Khamenei dead in the airstrikes, with 40-day national mourning announced and a temporary committee set up to exercise leadership. So how will the supreme leader's death affect Iran's political situation, especially the power transition and the military strategy against the U.S. and Israel?
Yeah, but I would like to respond to this question in the context of the goals that Israel and the United States have been trying to achieve in their acts of aggression against Iran. Israel and the United States, if you remember last year, in July last year, Israel launched war on Iran and the United States later joined Israel. Their main goal was regime change in Iran, but they failed to achieve their goal. And this time again, they targeted Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, in order to pursue their regime goal policies. But this time, even their plot will fall flat. Maybe less than a day after the death of Iran's leader, a 3-person council consisting of Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, Judiciary Chief Gholam Mohseni, and a jurist from the Guardian Council will temporarily assume the leadership duties until the next leader is elected. So the death of Iran's leader Ayatollah Khamenei, of course, is a grief for the nation, but Iran continues to, and the 3-person council will continue to take over the responsibilities of the leader, and the country will remain unharmed.
There were some progresses in U.S.-Iran diplomatic talks before the conflict, and now with the tensions rising and Iran's supreme leader's death, does Iran still see a chance for peace negotiations?
Since early February, Iran and the United States held 3 rounds of talks. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi led the talks, and on the US side, Jared Kushner and Donald Trump's son-in-law, Steve Witkoff, and Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, were leading the negotiations. And before Israel and the United States launched war on Iran, Iran and the US were expected to hold the 4th round of talks in Vienna. But the aggression against Iran showed that the United States only wants peace talks as a cover for military aggression. The same scenario was repeated even last year. In June last year, Iran and the United States had been scheduled to hold a new round of talks, but Israel launched war on Iran. So at the moment, while Israel and the United States attack Iran, it seems illogical to hold talks with the US unless the United States changes course and changes its attitudes. Almost a week ago, I joined the weekly press briefing of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, where the spokesperson stressed that if Israel and the United States attack Iran, Iran will not hold talks with the US because Iran considers this as an act of aggression, and Iran cannot, hold talks with the aggressors.
Shirok Sae with the Tehran Times, speaking with my colleague Xu Yawen. For more analysis, joining us now on the line are Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Fudan University, as well as Dr. Greg Barton, Professor of Global Islamic Politics with Deakin University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Okay, so Professor Barton, to start with you, to what extent, in your observation, do you think the conflict might widen in the foreseeable future?
I think the conflict is not likely to widen, but we need to preface all our discussion with saying no one knows. We're in dangerous territory. Anything could happen. But the reason why I think it won't widen, I think the strikes on Gulf state targets by Tehran are designed to put pressure on America to sort of quickly curtail this campaign. You could imagine having major world airlines who hub through Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha suspend flights and close the airspace is devastating for the growing Gulf state region. So I think this is designed to actually sort of bring an end to, or at least speed up the end of the conflict. I think if Tehran makes what, in my opinion, would be a mistake of having drones and missiles land at American bases in Turkey, that could draw Turkey into the conflict, and that's one way that it could expand. I think Saudi Arabia at the last minute went along with the conflict because it couldn't stop it, but I don't think it particularly wants to get drawn in. I don't think the Gulf states like the UAE want to get drawn in. So Turkey is the unknown. But as I said, so much is uncertain here, and that's the danger.
Okay. So, Professor Zhang Shuchu, would you share the same observation?
Well, right, I agree. Actually, but I would say spillover is already occurring. So the conflict has widened so far, and Iranian strikes have hit, targets in the Gulf, as my colleague has already mentioned, and also Israel has attacked Lebanon recently, and that, of course, expands the conflict regionally. Also, we can see that Iran's allies, like the Houthi rebels in Yemen, could also resume Red Sea shipping attacks, while Iraqi militias, which are pro-Iran, might also target certain United States forces there. So if the conflict prolongs, it could draw in more states. But I agree that a large-scale confrontation is not likely to last long because, first of all, the disparity in strength between the two sides, Iran and the United States, is enormous. Moreover, I think in the airstrikes on the 28th, actually, Washington first targeted the Iranian Navy, attacked several senior Iranian military commanders, and also even the supreme leader. And that kind of actions aims to disrupt Iran's command center. So therefore, it is very difficult for Iran to maintain a prolonged, intensive confrontation with the United States. But of course, low intense confrontation would remain. And also, on the other hand, the United States is also not willing to become deeply entangled in the region because, in fact, Donald Trump does not want to bear a big cost on it. And also with regard to his new version of national security strategy, he actually lowered the priority of the Middle East. So in general, I don't think a large-scale standoff is going to last long.
Okay. So, Dr. Zhang Chuchu, do you think the killing of Iran's supreme leader Khamenei is going to lead to regime change in Iran? Why or why not?
Well, I think so far there are still many uncertainties, and also it depends on how you're going to define regime change. Because, for instance, right now Iran's supreme leader has now been attacked. So, if the United States says, okay, the other people are still there, but we already cooperate with them. So Donald Trump can always say that he achieves his goal of regime change. But in any case, I would say there are three possible scenarios. The first one would be that the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps could be severely weakened, leading to a new United States-backed government, and so there is a regime change. In the second scenario, there could be no regime change with the original leadership remaining in power. And the third scenario is that there could be regime change, but with the Revolutionary Guard Corps severely weakened. But since there are intense power struggles between different factions, and that might prevent the formation of a new government, and that could potentially plunge Iran into instability. So I would say, so far for the United States, for Trump, negotiating a reconciliation with the existing powers is the least costly option, and the worst case scenario, and the most worrisome scenario is that Iran descends into a civil war and long-term chaos.
So, Professor Greg Barton, going back to you, do you see signs that other countries, a third country, might join this U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iran? We know, for example, in the case of Australia, we have seen its Foreign Minister Penny Wong telling local media on Monday that Canberra does not plan to do so.
Well, as we were just discussing, I think the most likely scenario there is that Turkey gets drawn into this conflict, but I'm sure it doesn't want to get drawn in. And if Tehran avoids striking even military bases in Turkey, it may avoid that. I think countries like Australia or Canada or the UK, they don't want to be seen publicly disagreeing with Donald Trump, or indeed making an issue of disagreeing with Netanyahu. But I'm sure privately their position is one of complete horror at the situation. They just want to stay out of the way and not get drawn in. So yes, there's a slight change in the UK allowing its bases to be used for operations, but I don't think anyone wants to get drawn into this. They'll leave it to America and Israel. And one of the problems here, going back to the earlier discussion, is that Israel probably does want to have Iran fall apart into civil war. I don't think that's what America wants. It's certainly not in America's interests.
So, are there signs that the Trump administration is prepared for a larger, longer military campaign against Iran, including its possible consequences like the potential for chaos in the country and regional ramifications, Professor Barton?
Well, in short, the Trump administration is not prepared for anything. This is the weakest administration in modern American history. The administration, of course, in Tel Aviv, the government of Benjamin Netanyahu also is very weak. I think both the IDF in Israel and the American defense community has been saying that this war is not a good idea. In particular, America has been warned, Donald Trump's been warned that as strong as America is, it actually doesn't have the strength that it thinks it has in this position because of critical limitations on supplies of munitions. So I don't think Donald Trump's planned this out. He has gone on record these last few hours saying this could go for 4 weeks. But I think he's doing something out of political will and hubris, egged on by Netanyahu, not because this is a good idea or it's been well planned for.
So, Dr. Zhang Chuchu, going back to you, what is your thoughts? What is your take on this point by Professor Greg Barton earlier that for the Israeli side, they are happy to see a civil war emerging in within the Iranian territory, but that's not something that Donald Trump wants to see or the U.S. government wants to see. I mean, if previously we were talking about this whole issue, we would probably say that Israel wants to have a military conflict with the Iranian side, but probably Trump does not want to have a military conflict. But now, both the United States and Israel are in terms of launching this military attacks on the Iranian side. So now when we talk about the prospect for a civil war, a civil conflict in Iran, what do you make of the divergences as well as the shared interests between Washington and Tel Aviv?
Oh, okay. Thanks so much. This is a very important point. In fact, I would say, first of all, I totally agree that there is a disagreement on the issue about the civil war. So for Israel, of course, especially for Netanyahu this year, he also faces the election. So he definitely wants to see this sort of uncertainty in Iran, but a prolonged warfare is not in the interest of Donald Trump. But however, there are a lot of shared interests between the United States and Israel, that is to weaken and undermine Iran at the moment. And for Donald Trump, actually, he has several objectives with regard to Iran. The first thing is that he's very interested in the oil and gas, because as Donald Trump, he's a transactional president. He's always looking for economic interest. And if you look at what has happened in Venezuela and Iran, why has he targeted these two countries? And one very apparent reason is because he's interested in Iran's oil and gas. The second issue here is that their shared interest is that both the United States and Israel wants to reshape the regional order in the Middle East. So for the United States, for Trump, he definitely wants to see a weakened Iran. And that is why he's trying to destroy the military capability of Iran, the nuclear facilities, and also the missile, in order to ensure that Israel takes the lead militarily in the Middle East. And also the United States wants to undermine Russia's influence. So so far as we see, Assad's regime in Syria has already came to an end. And right now, there is a conflict in Iran. The United States wants to strengthen its hegemony in the region. So that is what has happened. But however, there are disagreements, because for the United States, absolutely civil war is not a good idea, because Donald Trump, first of all, he doesn't want to bear a big cost on that. He's confident that he can finish the war within several weeks. We don't know whether that is going to happen. But on the other hand, also, he doesn't want to send ground troops so far. So that shows the difference between the United States and Israel.
Okay. Professor Barton, some say under international law, the attacks on Iran are neither preemptive nor lawful. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy to answer this one. The attacks are not lawful by any understanding of international law. The one way you might make a case for them being lawful is if there was a imminent danger and there had to be a preemptive strike to deal with that imminent danger. All of the evidence we have suggests that there was no imminent danger, that Iran doesn't have ballistic missile technology that could reach America or threaten American interests, doesn't have an active a nuclear weapons program that's an imminent threat. I mean, there's longer term concerns to be sure, but there was no excuse for this action. It was a political will rather than a strategic or lawful decision.
So, Dr. Zhang Chuchu, do you think the joint U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran represent a further erosion of the international legal order?
Right, I totally agree with that, because actually, so far, you can see that a new political phenomenon globally is that many populist forces are attempting to subvert the existing liberal international order. So the Trump administration in the United States and Netanyahu government in Israel have both actively avoided the constraints of international law and organizations on their actions, and instead they have attempted unilateral actions, disregarding international rules and humanitarian principles. This time we can see that in Iran, there are many civilian casualties. Like both Netanyahu and Trump believe that power alone allows them to do whatever they want. So I would say this is very dangerous because this will definitely have many dangerous consequences. When national sovereignty is violated and when the seriousness of international negotiations diminishes, it means that the international community might face more conflicts in the future.
Last year, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence once testified that Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons, and this point has also been affirmed by the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. However, those evidence, let's put it this way, that has not really prevented Iran from being attacked, either in the case of June last year or this latest episodes. So, Professor Barton, do you think the attacks on Iran is a signal that our world is further, going back to the law of the jungle where might is the absolute right?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack in that. I think we are at a point where 80 years of sort of predictable economic and political order has passed. We're at a inflection point. American leadership, as imperfect as it was, is no longer to be relied on. It's tempting to say it's just the law of the jungle, might is right. But what we've seen from two really quite radical extreme administrations in Israel and America is tactical brilliance. I mean, you saw that with many of the Israeli strikes, the destruction of Hezbollah, for example, and with the American operation in Venezuela. Tactical brilliance, but strategic incompetence. So yes, this is the law of the jungle, but it's not the law of jungle by smart, powerful forces that know what they're doing. It's something much more chaotic and uncertain.
Okay. Talking more about that, I mean, the strikes on Iran were actually launched while active indirect negotiations between Tehran and Washington were still going on. And I guess that, according to many people's opinion, has really, badly damaged the faith of the United States or the faith of the U.S. government, to put it this way. So, Dr. Zhang Chuchu, how do you think a scenario in which diplomacy has been used as a kind of deception, how could a scenario like that affect the prospect of political solution in other, say, military conflicts, such as the war between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, from my observation, I'd say there will be many very negative implications. One significant implication of the conflict is that, according to established international norms, negotiating parties typically demonstrate goodwill towards each other during negotiations. However, right now it means that the attack on the leader of one negotiating party suggests a decline in international trust in future international negotiations, and that could potentially lead to increased conflicts and friction between nations, and it's very hard to build trust between different countries. So what happens in Iran directly undercuts Washington's ability to act as an honest broker in any future negotiation. And also, right now, a lot of states actors will treat every United States diplomatic overture with extreme suspicion, because when the United States sits down at the table, then people would ask, is it genuine or is it just a cover for military preparations? And this raises the bar for any agreement dramatically. And also, in many countries, hardliners might gain upper hand because they would argue that in any case, the United States can just play with you. They don't really want a negotiation. And last but not least, this could also affect the confidence of mediators. So in the future, a lot of states would no longer be willing to mediate conflicts because they may also lose faith and credibility when they help arrange talks that are later seen as a ruse. So they become far more cautious about investing political capital in future United States-led process.
So in a situation where the United States is potentially losing its credibility as a credible mediator in military conflict, do you think that is making our world further go back to the law of the jungle? Professor Zhang Chuchu.
Right. I would say that is what is going on at the moment, because you can see that, in fact, if you look at what has happened in Iran, the United States and Israel had begun preparations for action against Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei at least a week ago. So this means that the previous nuclear negotiation were not a genuine attempt by the United States to de-escalate the conflict, but rather a tactic to lull Iran into a false sense of security. So it means that the nuclear talks, actually the United States does not care about the nuclear talk. So with or without a compromise on that issue, the attack is going to happen. So that is going to undermine the trust between countries, and also in the future, fewer and fewer of countries would, would like to have, genuine talks and negotiations with each other, and that means that it will be very hard for countries to reduce their differences by holding talks. So, that is a negative impact, like you said. So in the future, we might see more conflicts.
Okay. So, Professor Greg Barton, what do you make of the key and most important lesson that Iran or other third-party countries who are watching everything going on here need to draw or need to learn from what's going on here?
Well, there are many lessons, but one clear lesson is that American leadership, as we knew it, is gone. The last 13 months, Trump and his second administration has undermined American power and influence and credibility. Similarly, Netanyahu over the last 2.5 years has undermined a considerable amount of goodwill towards Israel and credibility and legitimacy. So I think those looking on for lessons would say, don't mistake tactical, brilliant, momentary successes for long-term strategic advances of your own self-interest. This is a case study in undermining your own self-interest through not thinking through what you're doing.
Dr. Zhang Chuchu, your final words regarding, say, the most important lesson we can learn from this.
Oh, right. So first of all, I would say I would say that for Israel and for the United States, actually, I would say the biggest negative impact is that international reputation can be damaged, no matter the military strength, and that is a very negative impact for them. And the second issue here is that, unfortunately, we might see further instability and chaos in the region. And last but not least, unfortunately, there are a lot of humanitarian crises in the Middle East, and what the international community can do is to reduce these crises and to provide more help and assistance to the local people.
Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Fudan University, as well as Dr. Greg Barton, Professor of Global Islamic Politics with Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.